The cowboys were already laughing when the smoke rose from the pit. They stood in a loose half-circle around the ranch. Barbecue, hats tilted back, boots dug into the Texas dirt, watching a group of Japanese women move stiffly around the grill like they were trespassing on sacred ground. One man snorted. Another shook his head. "They don't even know what they're doing." Someone muttered, amused. The women said nothing. They worked with borrowed knives, unfamiliar cuts of meat, hands steady despite the heat and the eyes on their backs. The smell was wrong for a Texas barbecue, too subtle at first, too quiet. Then it changed. Fat hissed. A new aroma crept into the air, sharp, savory, layered with something none of the cowboys could name. Laughter faded mid-breath. One by one, the men leaned closer, confused. When the first bite was taken, no one spoke. Not because it was bad, but because it wasn't. And in that silence, something dangerous began to happen. Respect. The smoke drifted low across the yard, thin and blue, curling toward the barbed wire like it was trying to escape the camp before anyone noticed. A few of the cowboys shifted their weight, boots grinding into gravel, hats tipped back just enough to keep the sun out of their eyes. They had been told this was harmless, a novelty. "Let the prisoners cook," someone had said. "Let them pretend." The laughter came easy at first, loose and careless, the kind that rises when no one expects to be challenged. One man nudged another with his elbow and nodded toward the women. "Too small, too quiet, too careful. Ain't this something?" he muttered, lips curling. "Bet they burn it." The women stood at the pit like guests who had arrived at the wrong house. Their uniforms hung awkwardly from their frames, fabric softened by too many washings, seams pulled thin at the shoulders. They did not joke. They did not look around. Each one focused on her hands, on the unfamiliar weight of the knives, on the heat pulsing up from the coals. The grill itself was a crude thing, blackened and scarred, smelling of old grease and mesquite, a place of loud meat and louder men. It was not meant for silence. Yet silence clung to the women like a second skin. The cowboys watched with open amusement. One leaned against a fence post, chewing on a piece of straw. Another folded his arms, waiting. This was how it always went, they assumed. The enemy exposed, stripped of mystery, reduced to awkwardness. Cooking, after all, was supposed to look a certain way here. Fast hands, big gestures, meat slapped down hard, flipped quick, smoke roaring. What the women did looked nothing like that. They moved slowly, almost reverently. One woman paused before placing the meat, fingers hovering as if listening for something the others could not hear. Another adjusted the fire, coaxing it rather than feeding it, spreading coals with the careful patience of someone used to making very little last. At first, the smell did not impress anyone. It was faint, restrained, wrong. A cowboy snorted. "That all?" he said, half laughing. Someone else shook his head. But then the air shifted. Fat touched heat and did not scream. It whispered. The smoke thickened, carrying something sharper beneath the familiar tang of barbecue. Not just meat, but depth, layers, a sweetness that didn't belong to sugar, a savor that lingered instead of shouting. The laughter thinned, breaking apart like ash. One man took a step closer without realizing he'd moved. Another frowned, confused, nostrils flaring. The women did not look up. They had cooked like this before, long before uniforms and camps and wire. In kitchens reduced to shadows, over fires made from scraps, they had learned that speed wasted flavor. That patience was not weakness. Each motion now came from memory buried deep, from a time when cooking was the only way to keep a family alive. when a meal had to mean something more than fullness. Their faces remained unreadable, not out of defiance, but out of habit. You did not invite attention when attention could turn cruel. When the first piece was lifted, juices glistening, the smoke rolled heavier, carrying the scent straight into the watching men. It tugged at something old in them, something beyond hunger, a memory of kitchens they hadn't thought about in years, of hands that cooked not to impress, but to care. One cowboy swallowed and felt foolish for it. He had expected spectacle, failure, proof. Instead, he felt unsettled. The women stepped back, making space, eyes still lowered. They did not present the food like a challenge. They offered it the way one offers anything fragile, without expectation. The yard had gone quiet enough that the sizzle sounded loud. No one spoke, no one laughed. The cowboys exchanged glances, uncertain now, the easy confidence gone. Somewhere beyond the wire, the wind stirred the dust. And in that pause, thick with smoke and smell and unspoken recognition, the camp held its breath, waiting for the moment when tasting would make retreat impossible. For the women at the grill, that waiting felt familiar. It had always been the waiting that hollowed you out first, waiting for rations to arrive, waiting for the siren to stop, waiting to see whether the pot would be enough for everyone. Long before Texas dirt and American cowboys, cooking had meant survival measured in minutes and scraps. In wartime Japan, food was not something you displayed, it was something you defended, something you hid, something you stretched until it no longer resembled itself. They remembered kitchens that were barely kitchens at all. A single burner fed by scavenged fuel, pots dented thin from years of use, rice measured not by bowls but by fingers, a handful of barley mixed in to make it seem fuller, sweet potatoes sliced so thin they turned translucent in the steam. Meat was a rumor. Oil was saved for the sick. When a neighbor disappeared, no one asked why. Hunger trained silence better than any officer ever could. Cooking then had been done with eyes always on the door, not because of thieves, but because of shame. To cook too well was to invite questions. To cook too often was to invite suspicion. You learned how to make food look smaller than it was, how to swallow your portion quickly so you would not think about the one you gave away. Mothers taught daughters not recipes, but restraint. How to lower your head when you were full. How to lie convincingly when asked if you had eaten. The lessons did not stop at the stove. They were reinforced everywhere. In classrooms stripped of heat, in assembly halls where slogans replaced meals. Americans, they were told, wasted food the way they wasted lives. They were loud, undisciplined, animal in their appetites. They cooked for pleasure, not necessity. They ate without gratitude. To fall into their hands was to be mocked, starved, humiliated. The stories were detailed, relentless. Even those who doubted learned to repeat them. Doubt, after all, burned calories you could not afford to lose. So when the war ended and surrender came, it did not feel like relief. It felt like exposure. The women were marched, shipped, processed, all while bracing for the moment when the stories would prove true. Some hid crumbs in their sleeves even when they were fed. Others refused unfamiliar food, convinced poison would taste exactly like kindness. Every unexpected softness was treated as a trap. Now, standing at a barbecue pit in captivity, holding ingredients they had not touched in years, those lessons pressed close again. Beef that was not bone, salt that could be used without calculation, spices that were not rationed out grain by grain. It felt wrong to have so much at once. wrong enough to raise suspicion. The women had exchanged glances when the ingredients were handed over, silent questions passing between them. Was this a test? A joke? An excuse to laugh when they failed? They cooked anyway. Because cooking was the one thing war had not managed to erase. Their hands remembered what their minds tried to forget. Not recipes written down, but instincts learned in scarcity. How to coax flavor from fat and heat alone. How to listen to food instead of forcing it. Cooking, for them, was not expression. It was memory made physical. Every movement carried the weight of kitchens left behind, of mothers bent over pots, of children watching carefully, learning without words. As the food finished and the smoke deepened, the women felt the old conflict tighten in their chests. If the Americans tasted this and laughed, it would confirm everything they had been taught. If they tasted it and liked it, that would be worse. That would mean the enemy was capable of recognition, of appreciation, of seeing. And once you were seen as something other than a caricature, the old stories began to rot from the inside. They stepped back from the fire, letting the moment approach on its own. Cooking had always taught them this much at least. You could not rush the reckoning. Still, the reckoning never arrived with ceremony. It came slow and lopsided. First in the tightening of a cowboy's jaw as he stared at the food like it had insulted him. Then, in the way his fingers hovered just a second too long before picking up a slice of grilled beef. He ate. And when he did, the others noticed how he didn't speak. That silence, unexpected, undecorated, rang louder than the laughter that had filled the yard moments before. The women did not meet their eyes. They stood just beyond the smoke, where the scent of meat still clung to their clothes, and the sun carved hard shadows across their faces. They were not nervous. They were used to being watched. They had been watched while they were herded onto trains, while they scrubbed floors for officers, while they were handed over as prisoners of a war they had not chosen to fight. But this watching was different. It was not the gaze of dominance. It was suspicion tipping into doubt. At the grill, nothing about them looked American. That had been obvious from the beginning: thin wrists, hunched shoulders, faces worn tight with discipline. But the difference ran deeper than appearance. The way they moved, the quiet they carried like a shield, the precision in their gestures, none of it fit the cowboy myth. Here, grilling was rowdy, noisy, full of jokes and smoke and speed. The Japanese women moved like ritual, not performance. Where the cowboys expected a show, they received a ceremony. The misunderstanding lingered like smoke in the throat. A few guards laughed again, not with confidence, but as if trying to resummon the spell of mockery that had already slipped through their fingers. "They still ain't flippin' it right," one said under his breath, though no one responded. Another man watched as one of the women adjusted the coals without flinching at the heat. Her face didn't change. Her hand held steady. She didn't glance up for praise. She just waited for the fire to tell her when it was ready. What the cowboys began to see, though they couldn't yet name it, was control. Not the kind taught in basic training or enforced by rank, but something older. A control born from not having control. The women cooked like people who had learned to adapt or die. Every movement bore the memory of scarcity, how to make small things last, how to make do, how to wait without wasting. The fire became the common ground neither side had expected. It was no longer a tool of spectacle, but a language. Through it, the women spoke fluently, telling stories without sound, of stolen childhoods, of kitchens gone cold, of hunger so deep it rewired the bones. The cowboys, for all their bravado, had no answer to that kind of fluency. They cooked for plenty. The women cooked for survival. And so, The fire stood between them not as a barrier, but as a mirror. The Americans saw themselves reflected in the ease they had mistaken for superiority. The women saw the fire for what it had always been: threat and opportunity in equal measure. One guard leaned forward and asked, without mockery, "What did you put in that?" The question hung in the air unanswered, not because it was rude, but because it was impossible. There was no word for grief cured in smoke, no recipe for memory made edible. The women did not respond. They didn't need to. They had said everything with the food. Behind them, the fire snapped, flame licking the air like punctuation. The grill hissed as juices hit metal. In the stillness, the cowboys began to see not enemy hands, but skilled ones. Not incompetence, but craftsmanship. And with that recognition came discomfort. Because when the enemy stops being a stranger, he starts being a person. And when a person feeds you something you cannot forget, you owe them something you didn't expect to give: attention, maybe even respect. But respect, like the fire, required tending, and no one yet knew if they had the stomach for what would come next. It started with a single piece of beef, still glistening from the grill, its edges crisp, the center warm and slick with fat. One of the cowboys, Harris, tall, red-faced, always the first to laugh, reached out. His hand hovered for just a second too long, the hesitation barely visible. Then he picked it up and bit into it. He didn't speak, didn't nod, didn't crack a joke. He just stood there, chewing slowly, staring at nothing in particular. His brow lowered. Something changed in the angle of his jaw. A breath caught in his throat like it wasn't sure what to do. Then, without looking up, he reached for another piece. The others watched him. At first, they waited for the punchline, for the wince, the gag, the sarcastic drawl, something to reestablish the natural order. But it didn't come. Harris kept eating, lips pressed tight. When he finally looked up, his face said only one thing: "It's good." That broke the line. Another cowboy stepped forward, then another. The tray, resting on a makeshift table next to the grill, was suddenly surrounded. No one rushed. But the silence was different now, tense in its restraint, reverent in a way none of them had prepared for. The first bites came with careful hands, like the meat might vanish if handled too roughly. The moment the food touched their tongues, expressions changed. Eyes blinked, mouth stilled. What had smelled interesting now tasted unfamiliar, deep, rich. The flavors were layered: miso, soy, smoke, sweetness just barely hinted at. The meat was tender but not soft, the kind that had been watched over, not thrown down. It was nothing like the rough and ready char they were used to. One man tried to speak, failed, then tried again. "Damn," he muttered. Not loud, not laughing, just honest. Behind the grill, the women stood motionless. Their hands were folded in front of them or tucked into sleeves. Their faces, stone still. But their eyes told a different story, watching every reaction with the precision of a medic checking for pulse. They had braced for mockery. They knew how to handle that. But this silence, they didn't know what it meant yet. They waited like they always had, quietly, cautiously, without demanding anything. The absence of ridicule wasn't quite safety. It was confusion, and confusion was dangerous. The cowboys didn't know where to put their eyes. Some looked down at their boots. Others kept their attention fixed on the food, as though it might grant them answers. One tried to offer a smile, but it faltered midway and collapsed into a nod. He chewed slowly, like the taste itself was something to process. What unnerved them wasn't just that the food was good. It was how good it was. Good in a way that wasn't accidental. Good in a way that meant the women knew exactly what they were doing. And if they knew how to cook like that quietly, confidently, what else had they known all along? What else had they hidden behind their silence? That was the real reversal. Not just that the food tasted better than expected, but that it demanded respect in a language the cowboys hadn't practiced. No one had taught them how to respond to grace from someone they'd been told to pity. One cowboy finally broke the pause. "Where'd they learn to do that?" he asked. No one answered. Because the truth was, it didn't matter where. What mattered was that they had. Across the yard, the smell lingered, a smoky ribbon that trailed into the sky. It smelled like nothing the Americans had made themselves, and yet it felt familiar, like a memory they didn't own but somehow recognized. The women remained still. They didn't smile. They didn't bow. But in one pair of eyes, there was something close to release. Not relief, just the smallest easing of a held breath. They had let their food speak, and the silence that followed was the clearest answer they had ever received. But silence, like smoke, never stays in one place for long. It seeps into corners, clings to clothing, and slips beneath the skin. As the last of the beef disappeared and the coals dimmed into a soft orange glow, something hung in the air that no one dared name. It wasn't just respect. It was recognition, and with it, the discomfort that always follows when a story begins to unwind itself. For the Japanese women, this moment was not triumph. It was exposure. They hadn't cooked to impress. They had cooked because it was all they had left that belonged to them. A knife, a flame, a memory of how fish used to be salted by the sea. Their mothers had taught them. Their grandmothers had shown them in cramped kitchens during war, where rice was stretched and flavor salvaged from bones. Here, in captivity, that knowledge was not just survival. It was selfhood quietly reclaimed one dish at a time. What the cowboys tasted was not seasoning. It was skill, passed through generations and sharpened by hunger. They'd expected burnt rice and foreign mistakes. What they got was precision honed under pressure, grace formed in scarcity. Every bite reminded them these women had lived differently, had suffered differently, had learned not from books or barracks, but from deprivation so deep it could not be spoken about in their language. And now, after months of guarding them with suspicion, they were the ones being fed. That reversal carved into the men more deeply than they let on. The cowboys were raised on plenty. Most of them had never gone a day without meat, coffee, or sugar. Even during the war, their worst days held more comfort than these women had likely seen in years. And now they were eating the food of prisoners. Food made not with American bravado, but with foreign patience. It wasn't just delicious, it was humbling. Guilt came quietly, as it often does, not announced, not even fully understood, just a shifting in the gut, a bite taken slower, a joke left untold. They had called the women slant-eyed, silent, strange. Now they chewed, and something tasted different, not in the food, but in them. Some turned away from the table early, claiming they were full. Others lingered, eyes downcast, not knowing whether to offer thanks or keep their mouths shut. No one told them what the right thing was. They were in a moment beyond orders. The women said nothing either. They cleaned quietly. They wiped the table. One woman refolded a rag 3 times before setting it down, each fold as precise as a line of calligraphy. To the men watching, it looked like habit. But for her, it was something else. Dignity, preserved through motion. Food, after all, was never just food. It was a language for what could not be said aloud. It was apology without shame, pride without arrogance. For the Japanese prisoners, cooking had become the only safe form of expression. They couldn't protest their captivity. They couldn't reclaim their names. But they could serve something warm, and in doing so, serve a reminder that they were still human, still whole, even in pieces. And for the cowboys, the food refused to be forgotten. It lingered in their mouths long after the fire died down, and in their minds long after the trays were cleared. Not because it was foreign, but because it was familiar in a way that felt impossible. It carried the ache of family, of sacrifice, of care taken by someone who expects nothing in return. In that moment, there was no victory, no forgiveness, no sudden friendship, but there was something else. The first thread, frayed and small, of mutual recognition, a fire, still burning this time between people. The next day, the yard sounded different. Not quieter exactly, but flatter, as though a layer of noise had been peeled away and not replaced. The cowboys still gathered by the fence in the morning. They still leaned on posts and spat dust and squinted into the sun, but the jokes didn't come back. The easy laughter that once rose on instinct now stalled somewhere behind the teeth. When someone started to say something sharp, it died halfway out of his mouth. The women noticed immediately. They noticed everything. Silence had trained them that way. Work details resumed, but with a subtle shift. When the women passed carrying supplies, no one stared openly. When they were assigned tasks near the kitchens or the fire pits, there were no muttered comments, no exaggerated sighs. One cowboy stepped aside to let a woman pass, and then looked faintly surprised that he had done so. He scratched his neck and stared at the ground, as if courtesy had slipped out of him by accident. They were no longer being watched as curiosities. That, perhaps, was the strangest part. The women had learned how to endure ridicule. They had learned how to make themselves small under it. But this absence of mockery required a different kind of vigilance. Respect, when it arrives quietly, feels almost like danger at first. At the grill later that week, one of the cowboys approached not with a smirk, but with a question. It wasn't criticism, it wasn't instruction, it was curiosity. The woman he addressed didn't answer right away. She looked at the fire, then at the meat, then back at him. Her eyes held no challenge, only assessment. Finally, she nodded once. That was all. But the nod carried weight. It was an acknowledgement, not submission. The other cowboys watched from a distance, pretending not to. This was new territory, a conversation without dominance, an exchange that didn't require anyone to lose face. The men felt the ground shift beneath habits built over years. They were used to authority that announced itself, used to power that shouted. What they were seeing now unsettled them because it was quieter and because it worked. Behavior began to change before anyone named the reason. Plates were offered instead of tossed. Requests replaced commands. The women were asked, not told, when cooking was involved. Someone brought them better knives without explanation. Another fixed a loose hinge near the pit so it wouldn't squeal. None of it was formal. None of it was discussed. But all of it mattered. Power, when it softened, did not vanish. It redistributed itself in small, almost invisible ways. The women still lived behind wire. The guards still carried rifles. But within the narrow space of daily routine, a balance was recalibrating. Competence had done what protest could not. Skill had spoken where language failed. The cowboys felt it too, though they would never have said so. Respect born from competence felt safer than respect born from pity. It allowed them to remain who they thought they were while adjusting what they believed about the people in front of them. They told themselves they were simply recognizing good cooking. But beneath that explanation was something more difficult to admit. They were recognizing equals in one narrow, undeniable way. At night, the women returned to their quarters and spoke in low voices. Not of freedom, not of hope, but of observation. They talked about the questions instead of the laughter, about the way eyes lingered without mockery, about the way hands hesitated before issuing orders that no longer felt automatic. These were small victories, if they could be called that, fragile ones. But in a world defined by power, fragility was often where change hid. The laughter did not return, and that absence created space. Space for awkwardness, space for restraint, space for something neither side yet trusted. No one called it respect. No one celebrated it. It arrived the way morning light does slowly, without asking permission, illuminating details that had always been there but never seen. That night, the smoke did not leave with the fire. It followed them back to their separate corners of the camp, clinging to clothes, hair, and memory. For the women, it settled deepest in the quiet after lights out, when the day no longer demanded attention and the mind had room to wander. They lay on narrow bunks, hands folded over blankets, staring at ceilings darkened by age and dust. The smell lingered on their fingers, faint but unmistakable, and with it came images they had not summoned in years. One woman saw her mother's kitchen before the windows were taped and the shelves went bare. A low table, a chipped bowl, rice steaming just enough to fog the air. She remembered how her mother used to taste the broth and frown, then add a pinch of salt she pretended not to save for herself. Another woman thought of her grandmother's hands, thick with work, showing her how to listen for the sound oil made when it was ready. Not rushing, never rushing. The war had taken those kitchens first, not with bombs, but with hunger, with rules, with fear. The smoke had carried those kitchens back, if only for a moment, and the weight of that return pressed heavy on their chests. Nostalgia was dangerous. It made the present harder to endure. It made captivity sharper by reminding them of what had been normal once. Some turned their faces to the wall and swallowed quietly. Others closed their eyes and let the memories come anyway, because to remember was to prove that something of them had survived intact. Across the camp, the cowboys were restless. Supper had ended hours ago, but the taste still lingered, stubborn as a tune you couldn't shake. Men sat on their bunks or leaned against walls, boots unlaced, hats set aside. Someone rolled a cigarette and forgot to light it. Another stared at his hands like they belonged to someone else. They thought of kitchens, too, though they would never have admitted it aloud. A woman back home standing at a stove, a pot of beans simmering slow while the radio played. A mother who cooked without measuring, who knew by smell alone when something was ready. The food they had eaten that day had touched something older than the war, older than uniforms. It reminded them of being fed not because they had earned it, but because someone cared whether they were hungry. That realization brought discomfort. Shame, even. They had eaten well while others starved. They had laughed while the women across the fire carried memories of empty pots and ration lines. The smoke had not just fed them, it had accused them. Quietly, without words. One man sat on the edge of his bunk and rubbed his face hard, like he was trying to erase a thought. Another muttered that it was just food, nothing more, but his voice lacked conviction. Food was never just food. Not when it carried history in its flavor. Not when it reminded you that the people you guarded had once lived lives as ordinary as your own. In the women's quarters, no one spoke for a long time. When they did, it was barely above a whisper, a name mentioned, a place, a memory of laughter that used to come easily. The smoke had given them permission to grieve something they had learned to lock away. And grief, once opened, did not ask whether it was convenient. The smoke thinned by morning, carried off by the wind. But what it left behind stayed, in the way eyes softened, in the way voices lowered, in the way both sides woke the next day carrying something heavier than hunger and harder to ignore. That morning, no one issued orders. There were no barked commands, no clipped English given slowly as if slowness could bridge the gulf. Instead, one cowboy, Callahan, the one with the scar above his brow and a voice like gravel, walked up to the mess line with his hat in hand. He scratched the back of his neck and nodded toward the Japanese women gathering near the embers of the fire pit. "You think you'd want to cook again?" he asked, not looking any of them in the eye. "If you want." It came out rough, unsure, not because he didn't mean it, but because he did. The women looked at each other, then back at him. It wasn't a trick, not an order, a request. That single shift changed everything. In wartime, to be asked genuinely was rare. To be trusted with fire again, after what it had stirred the day before, bordered on absurd. And yet, they said yes. By midday, the smells returned. But this time, the laughter didn't. Not because it wasn't allowed, but because it wasn't needed. The cowboys didn't lean back on their haunches and crack jokes about rice and seaweed. They didn't point at the way the women sliced scallions or simmered unfamiliar broths in familiar pots. They watched, yes, but differently now. They weren't sizing the women up. They were observing something they didn't understand and trying not to disturb it. The second barbecue unfolded not as performance, but ritual, something shared, if not yet spoken. No one declared a ceasefire. No one said the word respect. But it was there in how plates were handed over, how no one rushed the line. Some cowboys offered to carry water or stack firewood. One even asked how long the soy reduction took, stammered through. Half English, half pantomime, but asked all the same. The woman he asked blinked, then nodded. 2 hours, she said softly. He grinned, surprised she'd answered. Worth every minute, he muttered, and walked off. What the war had drawn as borders began, faintly, to blur. Not in declarations or shared songs, but in space. Shared space. Space without mockery, without suspicion. Around that fire. For a few hours, they were not guards and prisoners. They were people who missed home, people who missed mothers, and kitchens, and normalcy. The fire crackled, and plates were passed. And no one spoke about loyalty or allegiance. No one had to. The silence said more. For the women, cooking again felt different. Not like a task or a proving ground, but something reclaimed. They moved with rhythm, now choreographed not by fear, but memory. No more hunched shoulders or darting eyes. They stirred with purpose, stoked coals with care. They began to trust the act again, even if they could not yet trust the world around it. The food was not made to impress anymore. It was made to feed, and that mattered. For the cowboys, trust built the only way it ever does, slowly and through repetition. The second meal hit harder than the first, not just in flavor, but in meaning. If the first had stunned them, the second humbled them. This wasn't luck. It wasn't exotic flair. It was skill born of years, pain, hunger, and pride. To taste it again was to admit it had always been there. They had just been too blind, too smug, to see it. One man said, "Thank you." Just that. To no one in particular. The woman nearby heard it, paused, and gave the smallest of bows. The sun dipped lower as the fire burned down. The edges of the camp softened. For a moment, an hour, perhaps they weren't reenacting peace. They were living a fragile version of it. If you're enjoying this story so far, please like the video and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support helps keep these forgotten stories alive. That night, when the lights dimmed and the guard rotations resumed, something deeper began to stir, quiet and invisible, yet irreversible. In the women's barracks, after the trays were stacked and the last bowl rinsed with care, silence fell not out of exhaustion, but thought. Several of the women sat cross-legged on their cots, back straight, brushes in hand. On torn scraps of rice paper and even flattened ration packaging, they began to write. These weren't diary entries. These were letters, homeward, if they ever reached it. Maybe to sisters in faraway provinces, maybe to parents they weren't sure were still alive. But the act of writing had a weight to it. It meant reflection. It meant something had changed. One woman, Sachiko, paused before she dipped the brush. She had memorized the slogans taught in school, the ones that promised what Americans would do if she were ever captured. She had believed them when she was hungry, when her body was hollowed from rationed rice and sour cabbage, when the skies burned red with warnings. And yet, 2 days ago she had tasted brisket made tender in Coca-Cola, and yesterday a guard had waited while she adjusted the seasoning of the broth before lighting the fire. She did not know how to write that in a way that made sense, but she tried. Another woman, Misaki, asked for more paper. She didn't explain why, but when her letter was read, later smuggled out months afterward, she had written not about food or fire, but about dignity. That in a place built to erase who she was, someone had knelt to help her pick up a dropped spoon without sneer or command. That, once, a man who had laughed at her had said, "Please." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an end to the war, but it was something. For the Cowboys, too, the shift was slow and unspeakable. Some of them wrote home, too, though in very different tones. Not confessions, just pauses. One letter read, "They ain't what I thought, Ma." Another, "It's strange. They make food like my gran did, slow and quiet, but it don't feel foreign anymore." Ideology, it turns out, does not shatter like glass. It warps like wood in heat, slow, almost invisible. And that's what happened here. The women had been taught to hate. The Cowboys had been taught to mock. But the taste of something handmade, the sound of laughter not at their expense, the way a room felt when fear left for 5 minutes, all of that burrowed into them. By week's end, the barbecue pit had become a kind of shared shrine, not official, not sacred, but every meal felt different now. No one could look at the others without remembering how the air had once smelled like ginger and fire and smoke, and how that had mattered more than language. The women did not forget their homeland. They did not abandon their losses, but they stopped being just prisoners in their own minds. They were cooks, daughters, observers of contradiction. People who had lived long enough to unlearn what the war tried to carve into them, and once unlearned, it would never fully return. That was the cost and the gift of the fire they had stood before. The next morning, the coals had gone out. The pit lay still, a crust of white ash where fire had danced only hours before. The air smelled faintly of cedar smoke and soy, of charred sweetness that no one could quite name. A few flies circled, lazy in the heat, and yet no one moved to dismantle the site. The barbecue was over, but something clung to the edges of the camp, something unspoken. In the mess hall, breakfast resumed as usual. Powdered eggs, stiff toast, black coffee. But it tasted different now. not because the food had changed, but because those who ate it had. The cowboys were quieter, more restrained. No one mentioned the meal from the night before, but glances hung in the air like punctuation marks never spoken aloud. A gesture paused too long. A nod that once might have been a smirk, now given without irony. For the women, routine returned. Laundry, chores, barracks, checks. But they, too, moved with a slight difference, like people no longer entirely watched, or perhaps no longer afraid of how they would be seen. Nothing had been promised. Nothing had been offered. And yet everything had shifted. That night, the guards didn't lock the cooking shed. Someone had left the spice tins in reach. It might have been an oversight, or it might not. One woman, Yuki, traced her fingers along the edge of the pepper tin, then set it back down without using it. She didn't need to cook tonight. That wasn't the point. What mattered was knowing it was there, and that someone had trusted her enough not to hide it. The meal had ended, but the echo of it lingered. In the stillness of that dusty, sun-baked ranch, it was not the flavors that endured, but the humility. The realization for both captives and captors that dignity could not be rationed or assigned. It was something claimed in quiet acts. The way you stirred a pot, the way you handed someone a plate without mocking them, the way you listened even when words failed. Some things would not change. The war still raged in places far beyond the barbed wire. Orders still came from men who would never taste the meals or feel the silence after them. But here, in this strange pocket of unlikeliness, something had been exchanged. Not forgiveness, not forgetting, but recognition. The next week, one of the women was transferred out. No one said why. Her absence was noted with more than indifference. That night, a cowboy returned her spoon. He had kept it by mistake after the barbecue. He left it at the barracks door, cleaned. Another woman asked to sweep the fire pit, not because she was told, because she wanted to. And one cowboy, when writing home that Sunday, added a single line at the bottom of his letter. They cooked better than any man I know, and maybe better than Ma. Don't tell her that. The fire was gone. The smoke had faded. But the moment had marked them all. It did not change history. It did not rewrite the war. But it became part of the stories they would carry. The ones that rise unbidden in quiet moments, years later when the world has moved on and yet some scent or sound pulls them back. Back to a fire shared between enemies. Back to a taste they couldn't name, but never forgot. If this story moved you, please like the video and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for remembering history through human lives.